In the unforgiving mountains where only the strong survive, bandits prey on isolated homesteads, except one cabin they should have left alone. When the notorious Carson gang targets Sarah Blackwood's remote homestead, they mock her only companion, Shadow, her coal-black mountain hound with an uncanny gift, trained to track men through raging blizzards where no outlaw can hide. Now Sarah must decide, surrender to grief or unleash the storm hunter they unwisely provoked. The jagged peaks of the Widow's Range caught the dying light of day, transforming from rust red to deep purple as the October sun retreated behind them. Sarah Blackwood stood on her cabin porch, one hand resting on the smooth cedar railing her husband had crafted 3 summers before, the other absently stroking the massive head of the coal-black mountain hound beside her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Shadow's ears twitched forward, his amber eyes fixed on something in the distance that Sarah's human senses couldn't detect. "What is it, boy?" she whispered, her voice barely audible above the persistent mountain wind that whistled through the pines surrounding her homestead. The dog's muscles tensed beneath her fingertips, a low rumble building in his chest that never quite became a growl. At 8 years old, Shadow had been trained not to give away his presence with unnecessary noise, a skill that had saved both their lives more than once in these lawless mountains. Sarah's gaze swept across the rugged landscape that stretched before her homestead, 200 acres of wilderness that represented everything she and Thomas had dreamed of when they left the crowded streets of Denver behind. The cabin stood on a natural shelf halfway up Thornback Ridge, overlooking the winding trail that served as the only proper access to their remote home. Beyond that, pine forests gave way to rocky outcroppings before climbing toward the snow-capped peaks that remained white year-round. At 34, Sarah's face carried the weathered look of someone who lived by the mercy and cruelty of mountain seasons. Her dark hair, streaked prematurely with silver, was pulled back in a practical braid that hung between her shoulder blades. The rifle calluses on her hands had long ago replaced the ink stains from her former life as a schoolteacher. Those hands now moved with practiced efficiency to the Winchester repeating rifle that leaned against the porch post, always within reach. There it was, the distant but unmistakable sound of horses laboring up the steep mountain trail. The sound that had alerted Shadow minutes before it reached Sarah's ears. "Let's get inside," she murmured to the dog, who immediately fell into step behind her as she retreated through the cabin door, closing and securing it with the heavy oak bar Thomas had insisted on installing. No need to announce ourselves to strangers. The cabin Thomas Blackwood had built was modest but thoughtfully constructed for both comfort and defense. A single large room served as kitchen, dining area, and living space, with a loft above for sleeping. The thick pine logs had been carefully selected and fitted to withstand both the brutal mountain winters and any unwelcome visitors that might come calling. Inside, Sarah moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who had learned to live alone, but hadn't always been so. Though she had occupied the cabin by herself for nearly 2 years since Thomas's death, small reminders of their shared life remained. 2 rocking chairs before the stone fireplace, a pair of boots still waiting by the door, and the wedding daguerreotype carefully preserved on the mantel. Shadow took his position by the window, his body still and attentive as he tracked the approaching riders. Sarah checked that the shutters could be quickly closed from inside, then moved to the rear of the cabin, where a small window provided a view of the back trail, the escape route Thomas had insisted they always maintain. Satisfied it remained. Clear. She returned to the main room and busied herself with preparing evening coffee, though her attention remained focused on the sounds outside. The horses slowed as they approached the clearing around the cabin, their riders murmuring to each other in voices too low for Sarah to make out words. Shadow's ears pivoted, tracking each sound with military precision, a skill honed through careful training that had begun when he was just a pup under Thomas's patient guidance. "How many?" Sarah asked quietly, a command Shadow recognized. The dog tapped his paw against the wooden floor 3 times, their silent communication system that had started as Thomas's amusement but had evolved into something far more practical after his death. 3 riders then, possibly the hunting party from Elk Creek Settlement who sometimes passed through these mountains in autumn, or possibly not. The horses came to a stop in front of the cabin. Sarah heard the creak of saddle leather as men dismounted followed by the deliberate sound of spurs on the hard-packed earth approaching her porch. Shadow remained perfectly still by the window, only the slight arch of his neck betraying his alertness. A heavy knock landed against her door, followed by a voice that attempted warmth but carried an undercurrent of demand. "Hello, the cabin. Anybody home?" Sarah's hand drifted to the Colt revolver holstered at her hip, Thomas's final gift to her before he rode out with the posse 2 years ago. A posse that returned with 1 less man and a story about an ambush in Thunder Pass during an early autumn blizzard. A story with details that had never quite satisfied the widow they left behind. "Who's asking?" Sarah called, her voice steady and carrying no hint of the caution she felt. "Name's Lyle Carson," the voice replied with practiced charm. "My brothers and I are passing through looking for a man called Buchanan. Tracker said he might have come this way." Sarah stiffened at the name. Carson. Even in these remote mountains, the Carson gang's reputation had spread. 3 brothers who had graduated, from cattle rustling to bank robbery and worse, over the past 5 years. Their particular cruelty toward homesteaders who crossed their path was well known from Colorado to the Dakota territories. She also knew of no Buchanan in these parts. "Haven't seen any strangers," she responded, making no move toward the door. "You're a long way from the main trail, Mr. Carson," a different voice answered, deeper, with the rasp of someone who had spent too many nights drinking raw whiskey around campfires. "Told you this was a waste of time, Lyle. Let's move on before dark catches us in these mountains." Sarah recognized the ploy, the seemingly reasonable voice suggesting departure, designed to lower her guard and encourage her to open her door to prove she had nothing to hide. It was a tactic Thomas had warned her about during their evenings, discussing the outlaws who occasionally passed through these territories. "Ma'am," the first voice, Lyle, called again. "We've been riding since dawn, just looking for a place to water our horses before moving on. Maybe trade for some supplies." Shadow's ears flattened slightly, his body tensing as he detected something in their voices that Sarah could only sense as a vague unease. She placed one hand lightly on the dog's back, a silent command to maintain his position and silence. "Creek's a 1/4 mile east," she replied. "Help yourselves. I've got no supplies to spare with winter coming on." A third voice joined the conversation, younger than the others, but with a hard edge that belied its youth. "Ain't very hospitable, is she, Lyle? Ma taught us better manners than that." A laugh followed, the kind that contained no actual humor. "That she did, Jessie, that she did." The first voice, Lyle, adopted a more conciliatory tone. "We understand, ma'am. Times are hard up here. But we've got coffee and good tobacco to trade. Just a few minutes of your time." Sarah weighed her options. Refusing to engage further might provoke them, while appearing uncooperative could mark her cabin for a return visit when they'd had time to scout her defenses. Better to assess them directly and send them on their way with no reason to return. "Wait. And there," she said finally, moving toward the door, but positioning herself to the side rather than directly in front of it. With practiced motions, she lifted the heavy bar and opened the door just enough to see the men on her porch while maintaining cover from the thick oak planks. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us now. Back to the story. Three men stood in a loose semicircle, their postures deliberately casual, but with hands positioned for quick access to weapons. The oldest, presumably Lyle, stood closest to the door. In his early 40s, with a well-trimmed beard and the attire of a gentleman rancher, he projected an air of respectability that was immediately contradicted by the coldness in his eyes. The middle brother's weathered face bore a scar that ran from temple to jawline, his trail-worn clothes and unshaven appearance a sharp contrast to Lyle's cultivated look. The youngest, Jesse, couldn't have been more than 25, but his eyes held the flat, empty look Sarah had seen in men who killed without conscience. Ms. Lyle let the question hang. Mrs. Blackwood, Sarah replied, offering no first name or other details. Mrs. Blackwood, Lyle repeated with a slight nod that might have been mistaken for respect in different company. Traveling through these mountains can be treacherous. We'd be grateful for any assistance you might provide. Sarah held her position. In the partially opened doorway, as I said, creeks nearby for your horses. I can't help with supplies. The middle brother, the one with the scar, shifted his weight slightly, his gaze moving past Sarah to survey what was visible of the cabin interior. You alone up here, ma'am? These mountains ain't safe for a woman without protection. Before Sarah could answer, Shadow rose silently from his position by the window and moved to stand beside her, his massive form now visible to the men through the partially opened door. The dog made no sound, but his presence alone altered the dynamic on the porch. At nearly 30 inches at the shoulder and well over 100 pounds of muscle, the mountain hound cut an imposing figure. Lyle's eyebrows rose slightly. That's quite a dog you've got there, Mrs. Blackwood. He doesn't like strangers, Sarah replied simply, resting one hand on Shadow's head in a gesture that appeared casual but conveyed a specific command. Remain vigilant, but take no action without further instruction. Jesse, the youngest brother, gave a short laugh. Looks more like a wolf than a dog, probably half wild like everything else in these godforsaken mountains. He's exactly what I need him to be, Sarah said, her tone neutral but carrying a subtle warning. The scarred brother's hand drifted toward his holster in what might have appeared to be a casual movement, but Shadow's response was immediate. A low, rumbling growl that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the earth rather than the animal's chest. Wade, Lyle cautioned his brother sharply. Let's not agitate the lady's pet. Wade's hand stilled, but his eyes narrowed as he studied. The dog with new interest. Trained him yourself, did you? Or was that your husband's doing? The deliberate reference to a husband Sarah had not mentioned sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. These men had been watching her cabin, perhaps for longer than the mere hours it would take to approach from the main trail. They knew, or suspected, she was alone. My husband taught us both what we needed to know to survive in these mountains, she replied evenly. Now, gentlemen, the daylight's fading, and you'll want to make camp before dark. The weather turns. Quickly up here this time of year. Lyle studied her face for a long moment, calculation evident in his gaze. Of course, Mrs. Blackwood, we appreciate your hospitality. The way he hesitated before the final word carried clear sarcasm. Perhaps we'll have the pleasure of your company another time. Safe travels, Sarah responded, without acknowledging his implied return. Storms coming in from the north. You'd do well to head down toward the valley before it hits. As the men turned to leave, Jesse paused and looked back at Shadow with a smirk. Nice watchdog you got there. Better hope he can do more than growl when real trouble comes calling. The taunt hung in the air as the three brothers returned to their horses. Sarah remained in the doorway, one hand on Shadow's head, the other still resting near her holstered Colt until the sound of hoofbeats faded down the trail. Only then did she close and bar the door, her movements deliberate and controlled, despite the adrenaline coursing through her. "They'll be back," she said quietly to Shadow, who watched her with intelligent eyes that seemed to understand far more than any animal should. That wasn't a chance encounter. She moved to the rear window of the cabin, confirming the men were indeed heading down the trail rather than circling back immediately. The large cast-iron stove that dominated the kitchen area had been keeping a pot of stew warm throughout the afternoon. Sarah served portions for herself and Shadow, her movements automatic while her mind processed the encounter. The Carson gang's appearance at her remote cabin couldn't be coincidence. The fictional Buchanan they claimed to seek was obviously a pretext, but for what? Her homestead held little of value to men like them, no large herds of cattle, no gold or silver beyond the modest emergency fund Thomas had hidden beneath a loose floorboard. The nearest bank was in Cripple Creek, a 2-day ride through difficult terrain. As darkness settled over the mountain, Sarah lit a single lantern, keeping it away from the windows where its glow might be visible from a distance. She moved efficiently through her evening routine, checking ammunition supplies, confirming water barrels were full, and ensuring emergency packs remained ready by both the front and rear doors. Thomas had insisted on these preparations from the day they'd arrived in the mountains, drilling Sarah until the security measures became second nature. At the time, she'd found his caution excessive. Only after his death did she come to appreciate the thoroughness of his foresight. Shadow completed his own evening patrol of the cabin perimeter, returning through the specialized entrance Thomas had built into the rear wall. Large enough for the dog, but too small for a human intruder. The mountain hound shook himself, then settled before the fire, his eyes never leaving Sarah as she completed her preparations. "Storm's coming," she murmured, more to herself than to Shadow as she studied the sky through a small opening in the shutters. The stars had vanished behind a heavy blanket of clouds, and the wind had shifted to the north, carrying the unmistakable scent of snow. 2 days, maybe less. Early autumn storms in these mountains were treacherous, unpredictable in their intensity and duration. Most travelers with sense sought shelter in the valleys below when such weather threatened. But the Carson brothers struck Sarah as men who might use the cover of a blizzard to mask activities they preferred to keep hidden. As she prepared for bed, Sarah removed a worn leather journal from its hiding place in a hollowed-out Bible on the shelf above the fireplace. Thomas had started the journal when they first arrived, documenting everything from trail markers to the habits of local wildlife. After his death, Sarah had continued the practice, finding that systematic recording of observations helped maintain both practical security and her own sanity in the isolation of the mountains. She added detailed notes about the day's visitors. Descriptions, mannerisms, the questions they'd asked, and the implications of their knowledge about her situation. The practice helped order her thoughts, transforming vague unease into actionable information. When she finished writing, Sarah ran her fingers over the preceding pages, Thomas's bold handwriting gradually giving way to her more precise script. The transition marked the dividing line between the life they'd planned together and the solitary existence she now maintained. "What would you do, Thomas?" she whispered to the empty cabin. Shadow's ears perked up at the sound of his former master's name, his amber eyes fixed on Sarah with an almost human comprehension. As if in answer, her gaze fell on the final entry Thomas had made before riding out with the posse, never to return. The words seemed to rise from the page with renewed significance. "Remember what I taught you, Sarah. In these mountains, survival isn't just about strength. It's about preparation, knowledge, and knowing when to hunt instead of hide." Sarah closed the journal, returning it to its hiding place before extinguishing the lantern. In the darkness, she moved to the loft where her bed waited, Shadow taking his customary position at the top of the ladder where he could monitor both entrances to the cabin. As she settled beneath the heavy quilts that would soon be necessary, Against the winter cold, Sarah's mind continued to process the day's encounter. The Carson gang's appearance marked a turning point. The isolation she had maintained since Thomas's death was now compromised. Whatever their true purpose, their awareness of her vulnerability represented a threat that couldn't be ignored. What they couldn't know was that the widow and her watchdog they had so casually dismissed were far more dangerous than they appeared. Thomas hadn't just taught Sarah to shoot and hunt. He'd prepared her for the darker realities of frontier life, including how to track men who didn't wish to be found, even through the blinding chaos of a mountain blizzard. And Shadow? The dog they had mocked as a mere pet. He had been bred and trained for one specific purpose, trailing human scent through conditions that would defeat even the most experienced human tracker. The mountain hound's abilities in a snowstorm were nothing short of uncanny, a fact that had both fascinated and occasionally unsettled even Thomas. As sleep finally claimed her, Sarah's last conscious thought formed with crystalline clarity. If the Carson gang returned with intentions beyond casual intimidation, they would discover too late that they had threatened the wrong widow and taunted the wrong dog. The storm arrived sooner than Sarah had anticipated. By dawn, the first heavy snowflakes were already swirling past her frost-rimmed windows, carried on winds that moaned through the pine forest like lost souls. She rose in the grey half-light, muscles tensed from a night of fitful sleep, punctuated by dreams of pursuit through blinding snow. "Earlier than I thought," she murmured to Shadow, who stood attentively at the window, his breath fogging the glass as he studied the worsening conditions. October blizzards in the Widow's Range were notorious for their ferocity, often stranding even experienced mountain men in deadly whiteouts that could last for days. Rather than dampening her unease about the Carson gang, the approaching storm heightened it. Most travelers would seek shelter in the lowlands when facing such weather, but men with darker intentions might see opportunity in nature's fury. The storm would isolate her cabin completely, cutting off any possibility of assistance from the scattered neighbors miles away in the valley. Sarah dressed with practical efficiency, layers of wool and buckskin that would retain warmth even when wet, topped with Thomas's old sheepskin coat that hung nearly to her knees. Her preparations weren't just for the cold inside the cabin. Experience had taught her to dress as though she might need to venture out at any moment. "Come on, boy, let's check our supplies while we still have daylight." Moving through the cabin, Sarah took inventory with methodical precision. The root cellar beneath the kitchen floorboards contained enough preserved food to last through winter. The woodpile stacked against the north wall would provide heat for at least 3 weeks of severe weather. Water barrels were full, ammunition organized, and medical supplies accessible. Her assessment complete, Sarah turned her attention to the specialized equipment stored in the locked chest beneath her bed, gear that no ordinary homesteader would possess. Thomas had acquired it during his years as a scout for the army before settling with Sarah in these mountains, preparing for contingencies most would consider paranoid. The chest contained items that had seemed excessive when Thomas first showed them to her. Specialized snowshoes designed for silent movement, cold weather tracking equipment, and most importantly, the unique harness and trailing equipment he had designed specifically for Shadow. Sarah ran her fingers over the worn leather of the tracking harness, recalling Thomas's patient instructions. "It's not just about following a scent, Sarah. It's about reading the storm itself, understanding how the wind moves over the terrain, how snow buries and preserves evidence most eyes would miss." Shadow had watched the chest's opening with focused attention, his understanding of what the equipment represented evident in his posture. This wasn't the standard training most frontier families gave their dogs. This was specialized knowledge, developed during Thomas's years, hunting deserters and renegades through mountain winters where conventional tracking failed. "Not yet," Sarah told him, closing the chest and returning it to its place. "But soon, perhaps." As the morning progressed, the storm intensified. Snow accumulated rapidly, transforming the familiar landscape into unfamiliar terrain of white drifts and ghostly tree shapes. By midday, visibility had diminished to less than 50 yards, and the wind had risen to a constant howl that rattled the shutters despite their secure latching. Sarah was adding wood to the stove when Shadow suddenly tensed, his attention fixing on the rear wall of the cabin. No growl emerged, but every muscle in his powerful body had gone rigid with alertness. "What is it?" she whispered, immediately moving to extinguish the lamp that might silhouette her against the windows. In the dimness, she retrieved her rifle and moved to the small observation port Thomas had built into the shutters, a narrow slit that allowed viewing without exposing movement inside. At first, she saw nothing but swirling snow and the shadowy outlines of pine trees bending under the storm's force. Then a darker shape materialized briefly before disappearing again, the unmistakable silhouette of a mounted rider moving through the tree line approximately 80 yards from the cabin's rear approach. No traveler with legitimate business would approach from that direction, particularly in such conditions. The main trail to her cabin came from the east. The western approach was deliberately left unmarked, known only to Sarah and a handful of trusted neighbors who had visited during Thomas's life. A second shape appeared briefly, following the first at a cautious distance. Two riders, using the storm as cover to scout her property's vulnerabilities. Sarah's suspicions about the Carson gang's intentions crystallized into certainty. They weren't simply passing through. They had specific designs on her homestead. Shadows. Ears tracked the movements outside with uncanny precision, pivoting to follow sounds completely inaudible to Sarah through the howling wind. His training prevented him from barking to alert the intruders to his awareness, but his body remained coiled with potential energy, ready to move at Sarah's command. For nearly 20 minutes, the shadowy figures circled the clearing around the cabin at a distance, seemingly evaluating approaches and potential weaknesses. Sarah tracked their movements methodically, mentally noting the pattern of their reconnaissance. Their behavior confirmed they were experienced, not rushing recklessly, but conducting a deliberate assessment before committing to action. Eventually, the riders retreated into the thickening storm, becoming indistinguishable from the swirling whiteness that now enveloped the mountain. Sarah maintained her vigilance for another hour, rifle ready, before finally allowing herself to move away from the observation port. "They'll be back," she told Shadow, whose attentive gaze never left her face. "Not today. They're just scouting. But they'll return once they've formed a plan." The dog's understanding seemed to transcend normal animal comprehension, a connection forged through years of specialized training, and the bond that had deepened in the lonely months since Thomas's death. In that moment, Sarah felt a fierce gratitude for his presence. Without Shadow, she would have had no advance warning of the rider's surveillance. As daylight faded into the early darkness of a storm-shrouded afternoon, Sarah made a decision. Rather than waiting passively for whatever the Carson gang planned, she would seek information that might give her advantage. The nearest settlement, little more than a trading post and a cluster of cabins, lay 15 miles down the mountain, in Elk Creek Valley. If the Carsons were operating in the area, someone there would have information about their movements and intentions. The journey would be perilous in the current conditions, but Sarah knew trails that few others did, routes Thomas had shown her specifically for moving undetected through these mountains. With the storm expected to intensify overnight before breaking sometime the following day, she had a narrow window to reach Elk Creek and return before the Carsons made their move. "We'll leave at first light," she told Shadow, beginning preparations for the hazardous journey. "Just enough storm left to cover our tracks, but clearing enough to travel safely." She packed with efficiency born of experience, just essential. supplies, ammunition, and emergency provisions in a small leather pack that wouldn't hamper movement. Most importantly, she retrieved Shadow's tracking harness from the chest, checking each strap and fitting for wear that might compromise its function. The harness was Thomas's own design, crafted to distribute weight comfortably while integrating specialized equipment for mountain tracking. Most distinctive was the unique compass and direction indicator attached at the shoulder, allowing Sarah to read their heading even when blinding snow made conventional navigation impossible. As she completed her preparations, Sarah felt a strange calmness replace the tension that had gripped her since the Carson gang's appearance at her door. This was familiar territory, not the passive waiting of a potential victim, but the methodical planning of someone taking control of threatening circumstances. Thomas had trained her for precisely this situation. Now she would put that training to use. The night passed slowly, with Sarah sleeping in short intervals while Shadow maintained vigilance. The blizzard reached its peak intensity around midnight, wind shrieking against the cabin walls with such force that the entire structure seemed to shudder under its assault. By dawn, however, the storm's fury had begun to diminish. Exactly as Sarah had hoped, she dressed for the journey in layers designed for silent movement through snow, light-colored buckskins that would blend with the winter landscape, wrapped with white muslin coverings that Thomas had used during his scouting days. The outfit wasn't just practical camouflage. It represented Sarah's psychological transition from homesteader to hunter. Shadow watched with focused attention as she equipped herself, recognizing preparations that signaled a tracking expedition. When Sarah finally retrieved his specialized harness, the mountain hound's demeanor shifted subtly, his movements becoming more precise, his attention more concentrated, as though accessing specialized training that remained dormant during ordinary days. "Ready to work?" Sarah asked quietly, as she fitted the harness over Shadow's powerful frame. The dog responded not with typical canine enthusiasm, but with the focused intensity of a professional acknowledging an assignment. This wasn't play or typical hunting. This was the specialized work Thomas had bred and trained him for. They left the cabin through the concealed rear exit Thomas had built for emergencies, a low tunnel beneath the root cellar that emerged 50 yards from the cabin under a seemingly natural rock outcropping. The design served dual purposes, allowing unobserved departure and creating confusion for anyone attempting to follow their trail. The world outside was transformed. Nearly 2 feet of fresh snow blanketed the landscape, with deeper drifts gathered against trees and rock formations. The sky remained heavily clouded, but the snowfall had diminished to occasional flurries, and visibility had improved to several hundred yards, conditions suited perfectly to Sarah's purpose. She moved with practiced efficiency through the snow, following Shadow, who naturally broke trail with his powerful chest and legs. Their progress was silent, each step placed deliberately to minimize disturbance while maintaining reasonable speed. To an observer, they would have appeared as ghostly figures, barely distinguishable from the winter landscape, precisely the effect Thomas had designed the white coverings to achieve. The descent toward Elk Creek followed game trails and natural contours that avoided the main paths where travelers might be encountered. Sarah maintained constant awareness of their surroundings, pausing frequently to listen beyond the soft crunch of snow beneath their feet and the rhythmic breathing of exertion. Approximately 3 miles from the cabin, Shadow suddenly halted, his body tensing as his nose lifted to test the air. Sarah immediately froze in place, interpreting the dog's signal with the fluency of long partnership. Someone had passed this way recently, within hours, heading upslope toward her cabin. With a series of hand signals that required no verbal commands, Sarah directed Shadow to investigate. The mountain hound moved in expanding circles, nose working just above the snow surface until he located the disguised trail. 3 horses, moving with deliberate care to minimize tracks, but not careful enough to evade Shadow's specialized senses. "Show me," Sarah whispered. Shadow led her to what appeared to be an unremarkable snowdrift against a fallen log. Most eyes would have seen nothing unusual, but Sarah had been trained to recognize the subtle irregularities that betrayed human passage. The slightly different crystalline structure where snow had been disturbed, then recovered by fresh fall. The almost imperceptible compression pattern distinct from natural accumulation. With practiced movements, she brushed away the surface layer to reveal the partially filled hoofprints beneath. 3 horses moving upslope through the night. As the storm began to wane, the Carsons had returned to her mountain, timing their approach to the storm's natural cycle with the expertise of men accustomed to using weather as tactical advantage. The discovery altered Sarah's calculations. Rather than continuing toward Hell Creek, she now needed to understand where these men had established their base of operations. The prints were fresh enough that Shadow could track them to their source, likely a sheltered camp within striking distance of her cabin. "Find their camp," she commanded softly, an instruction Shadow recognized from their training exercises. The mountain hound immediately oriented himself to follow the trail backward, nose working methodically, just above the snow surface, where human scent remained trapped despite the fresh snowfall. They moved with increased caution now, Sarah frequently scanning the white landscape for sentries or scouts the Carsons might have posted. The trail led them along a winding route that utilized natural terrain features for concealment, another indication that these men possessed wilderness skills beyond common bandits. After nearly an hour of careful tracking, Shadow signaled, with a nearly imperceptible change in posture, that they were approaching their quarry. Sarah immediately dropped to a crouch, signaling the dog to hold position while she conducted visual reconnaissance. A narrow draw between 2 rocky ridges opened before them, sheltered from the worst of the storm's fury by the natural windbreak of stone and dense pine. Within this protected pocket, partially concealed by a stand of blue spruce, stood a small camp, 3 horses picketed beneath a crude lean-to constructed of pine boughs, and a small fire burning with minimal smoke beside a canvas tent. Sarah counted 3 figures moving around the camp, the Carson brothers, exactly as she had suspected. Their position was well chosen for a temporary base of operations, close enough to her cabin for easy access, yet naturally defended against approach with limited avenues that would force any visitor to expose themselves before reaching the camp. From her concealed position, Sarah observed their preparations with growing unease. These weren't the actions of men planning simple robbery. Lyle Carson appeared to be reviewing what looked like a hand-drawn map spread on a flat rock beside the fire. The scarred brother, Wade, was methodically checking weapons, including what appeared to be dynamite sticks bundled together. The youngest, Jesse, moved between the horses and the fire, occasionally reporting something to Lyle that caused him to make adjustments to whatever he was planning. Their behavior suggested a calculated operation rather than opportunistic violence. Something beyond the typical pattern of robbery and intimidation the Carson gang was known for. The presence of explosives particularly troubled Sarah. Such destructive tools had no place in ordinary theft. She watched for nearly 20 minutes, gathering information about their movements and apparent intentions, before deciding she had pressed her luck far enough. Discovery now would eliminate any advantage her knowledge might provide. With silent signals, she directed Shadow to retreat, backing carefully away until they were safely beyond visual or auditory detection. Only then did she permit herself a full breath, processing what she had witnessed. "This isn't just about robbery," she murmured to Shadow as they made their way toward a vantage point that would allow her to survey the terrain between the Carson camp and her cabin. They're planning something specific. The mountain hound maintained vigilant attention to their surroundings as Sarah considered the implications. The Carsons' reputation for violence was well established throughout the territory, but their targets typically consisted of banks, stagecoaches, and occasionally wealthy ranches, places with obvious valuable assets worth the risk of confrontation. Her modest cabin held little that would attract such deliberate attention from established outlaws, unless they knew something she didn't. The thought stopped Sarah mid-stride. What could her remote homestead possibly contain that would warrant such elaborate preparations? The only item of significant value was Thomas's gold pocket watch, a family heirloom she kept in the hidden compartment beneath the floorboards. Hardly worth the effort the Carsons were expending, unless their target wasn't something in her cabin, but the location itself. Thomas had chosen their homestead site carefully, citing the defensible position and reliable water source. But he had also mentioned another advantage, one Sarah had nearly forgotten until this moment. Their cabin stood at the junction of 3 major game trails that connected different parts of the widow's range. Anyone controlling that position effectively controlled movement through a significant portion of the mountains. A hideout, she whispered, the realization crystallizing. They want a secure base for winter operations. The strategic value of her cabin suddenly became clear. With the main trails down to Elk Creek and across to Thunder Pass, frequently snowbound during winter, law enforcement rarely ventured into the high country until spring thaw. A well-provisioned cabin at the junction of game trails would provide the perfect headquarters for a gang expanding their territory. Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily as anger rose within her, not just at the threat to her safety, but at the calculated intention to take what she and Thomas had built together, to transform their home into a base for the very kind of violence Thomas had spent his life opposing. Not while I draw breath, she promised quietly, her resolve hardening into something cold and dangerous as the surrounding snow. With new understanding of the Carsons' likely intentions, Sarah altered her plans. Rather than continuing to Elk Creek, she would return to the cabin by an indirect route, utilizing the remaining daylight to establish defensive preparations Thomas had designed, but she had never fully implemented. Shadow sensed the change in her demeanor, his own posture shifting to match her focused determination. The bond between them transcended ordinary human-animal relationships. In moments like this, they functioned as a single tactical unit with complementary capabilities. As they began the careful journey back toward the cabin, Sarah's mind worked methodically through what she had learned and what she must now do. The Carson gang had made a fundamental miscalculation. They had seen a widow alone in a remote cabin and presumed vulnerability. What they couldn't know was that Thomas Blackwood hadn't just built a frontier home. He had constructed a defensive position with multiple contingencies for precisely the situation Sarah now faced. Features that appeared decorative or practical to casual observation actually served strategic purposes, from the specific placement of windows to the seemingly ornamental iron brackets supporting porch posts. Most importantly, they had ridiculed the one asset that gave Sarah her greatest advantage, the coal-black mountain hound, whose specialized training made him a lethal weapon in the snow-covered terrain they would soon need to cross. They mocked what they didn't understand, Sarah whispered to Shadow as they moved silently through the winter landscape. That's going to cost them dearly. Dusk was settling over the mountains when Sarah and Shadow reached the concealed entrance to their cabin. The storm had left behind a crystalline stillness, the kind of absolute quiet that amplified even the smallest sounds across snow-covered terrain. Perfect conditions for ambush or defense, depending on who held the advantage of preparation. Rather than entering immediately, Sarah circled her property at a safe distance, studying it through the eyes of a potential attacker. The cabin appeared undisturbed, chimney cold with no smoke to betray occupation. Fresh snow covered the clearing, unmarked by tracks. Exactly as she had hoped. To anyone watching, it would seem she remained inside, unaware of the danger approaching through the gathering darkness. Only after confirming no observers lurked nearby did Sarah and Shadow slip inside through the hidden entrance. The cabin's interior was cold but secure, exactly as they had left it hours earlier. Sarah moved with practiced efficiency, avoiding lighting lamps that might be visible from outside. Instead, she worked by the faint blue glow of twilight filtering through the shuttered windows, her hands remembering tasks her eyes could barely see. Time to implement Thomas's contingencies, she whispered to Shadow, who watched attentively, as she moved to the large river stone that formed the cornerstone of the fireplace. What appeared to be solid masonry was actually a cleverly disguised storage compartment, one of many hidden caches Thomas had built throughout the cabin. The stone pivoted on a concealed axis, revealing a space containing items no ordinary homesteader would possess: specialized ammunition, defensive tools, and most importantly, the detailed plans Thomas had drawn for defending their mountain home against multiple attackers. Sarah spread the weathered parchment on the kitchen table, studying the precise diagrams by touch as much as by sight. Thomas had been methodical in his preparations, marking primary and secondary defensive positions, creating fields of fire that covered all approaches, and identifying natural features that could be used to channel attackers into vulnerable positions. Most conventional frontier defenses focused on reinforcing the cabin itself, barricading doors and windows against direct assault. Thomas's approach was fundamentally different. He had designed a system that extended far beyond the cabin walls, utilizing the surrounding terrain to create a defensive perimeter that would confuse and separate attackers long before they reached the structure. Outside defenses first, Sarah decided, while we still have some light. She gathered the supplies indicated in Thomas's plans, items that had seemed excessive when he first acquired them, but now represented their best hope for survival. Tripwires disguised as ordinary cord, carefully modified bear traps that would immobilize without maiming, noisemakers crafted from tin cans containing pebbles designed to alert defenders to movement along specific approaches. Shadow accompanied her as she moved methodically around the perimeter of the clearing, installing Thomas's defensive measures exactly as his diagrams indicated. The dog's presence wasn't merely companionship. His specialized senses detected subtle changes in wind direction and terrain features that Sarah's human perception might miss. Together, they transformed the seemingly ordinary landscape into a carefully orchestrated defensive system. By full darkness, they had established the outer perimeter. Any approach to the cabin would now trigger alerts or impediments that would provide crucial warning and slow attackers. But these outer defenses were merely the first layer of Thomas's comprehensive strategy. Back inside, Sarah retrieved more specialized equipment from hidden compartments beneath floorboards and behind cabinet panels. Each cache contained items designed for specific scenarios, tools and weapons Thomas had acquired during his years as a scout, adapted for the particular challenges of defending an isolated mountain homestead. Most valuable were the specialized ammunition rounds Thomas had modified for their particular situation. Ordinary bullets might be effective in conventional confrontations, but mountain conditions demanded adaptations. The custom-loaded shells contained mixtures designed for specific purposes: illumination, noise generation, or maximum stopping power, depending on the need. "This is what they didn't understand when they came calling, Shadow," Sarah said quietly as she loaded the specialized ammunition into carefully arranged positions around the cabin. Thomas didn't just build a home, he created a fortress, the Dog's attentive gaze followed her movements, his understanding seemingly transcending normal animal comprehension. Their partnership had evolved in the months since Thomas's death, deepening into something that blended her human strategic thinking with Shadow's instinctive capabilities in a way that made them far more effective together than either would be alone. As midnight approached, Sarah completed the interior preparations. Every window now concealed a defensive position with pre-calculated fields of fire. The apparently decorative beams supporting the ceiling contained hidden mechanisms that could be triggered to create barriers or reveal concealed shooting ports. Even the furniture had been arranged to provide cover while maintaining clear lanes of movement throughout the cabin. Only after all defensive preparations were complete did Sarah permit herself to light the small stove, carefully shielded to prevent any telltale glow from escaping through the shuttered windows. The meager heat was welcome after hours working in the cold, but more important was the opportunity to prepare herself physically for what lay ahead. She ate sparingly. Dried meat and hardtack supplemented with snow-melted water. Shadow received a carefully measured portion of his own provisions, calibrated to provide maximum energy without inducing the lethargy that might follow a larger meal. Every decision now was tactical, focused on maintaining optimal readiness for the confrontation that would inevitably come with dawn. While the small fire burned down to embers, Sarah retrieved her journal from its hiding place and made what might be her final entry. The Carson gang has chosen my home as their target, likely for use as a winter headquarters due to its strategic location. Their reconnaissance suggests attack at dawn, approaching from the western ridge where they believe themselves unobserved. They have explosives and significant firepower, with a clear willingness to use lethal force. I have implemented Thomas's defensive preparations as designed. Shadow is equipped and ready for winter tracking operations if necessary. If I do not survive the coming confrontation, this record should establish that my actions were taken in lawful defense of life and property against men whose violent intentions were well established throughout the territory. Thomas, if somehow you can see this from wherever you've gone, know that I'm using everything you taught me. Our home will not fall to men like these without exacting a price they never anticipated paying. She signed and dated the entry before returning the journal to its hidden compartment. The writing wasn't merely record-keeping, it had served as a final mental preparation, organizing her thoughts and cementing her resolve for what morning would bring. 3 hours until first light, she told Shadow, who maintained his vigilant attention despite the long day. Get some rest while you can. The mountain hound settled into his designated position near the rear wall, a location that provided both protection and quick access to multiple defensive positions within the cabin. Sarah followed her own advice, stretching out on the narrow bed fully clothed, rifle within immediate reach. Years on the frontier had taught her to take sleep when available, regardless of circumstances. Her rest was light but effective. More recovery than true sleep, with senses remaining partially alert to any change in the environment around her. Shadow's presence provided additional security. His specialized hearing would detect approaching danger long before human senses could perceive it. 2 hours before dawn, Sarah woke fully, instantly alert, without the disorientation that often accompanies sudden awakening. Shadow was already on his feet, head turned toward the western wall of the cabin, ears pivoting to track sounds inaudible to human hearing. "They're moving early," Sarah whispered, recognizing the dog's alert posture. Smart tactic, approaching in the darkest hours before dawn when visibility was at its worst, and defenders potentially at their lowest ebb of alertness and energy. She moved silently to her primary observation position, a narrow gap in the shutters that provided visual coverage of the western approach without exposing her presence. The pre-dawn darkness revealed nothing to her human vision, but Shadow's continued attention confirmed movement beyond the clearing. Sarah activated the first element of Thomas's defensive system, a specialized listening device he had adapted from equipment used during his scouting days. The curved metal cone, positioned against a small port in the western wall, captured and amplified distant sounds that would otherwise remain inaudible. Through this device, she detected what Shadow had already sensed, the soft crunch of snow beneath cautious footsteps, still distant but steadily approaching. The pattern suggested multiple individuals moving with deliberate stealth, spreading out to approach the cabin from different angles simultaneously. Coordinated approach, Sarah murmured. Not their first ambush. She positioned herself at the primary defensive station, rifle ready but not yet deployed. Thomas's strategy emphasized observation and information gathering before commitment to specific action. Understanding the attacker's pattern of approach would determine which defensive measures to trigger and when. Shadow moved to his assigned position near the concealed rear exit, ready to deploy outside if Sarah's commands required it. His specialized training included autonomous operation around the cabin perimeter, a capability that would allow Sarah to maintain interior defense while the dog monitored external movements. Through the listening device, Sarah tracked the approaching footsteps. 3 distinct patterns. The Carson brothers spreading out to surround the cabin. Their movement suggested professional experience, maintaining consistent spacing while adapting to terrain features. These were not impulsive bandits, but methodical operators executing a planned assault. The footsteps paused approximately 100 yards from the cabin perimeter, precisely where Thomas had anticipated attackers would establish their final coordination position. The natural depression there provided cover while offering clear sightlines to the cabin, making it the logical choice for last-minute planning before assault. Sarah permitted herself a grim smile. Thomas's understanding of tactical approaches had proven accurate once again. The Carsons had selected exactly the position he had predicted and prepared for. She reached beneath the windowsill to the small lever concealed there, one of many defensive triggers positioned throughout the cabin. This particular mechanism controlled what Thomas had called the early warning system, a network of tripwires and noisemakers positioned specifically to disrupt coordinated attacks during their final approach. Sarah held her position, waiting for the optimal moment. Triggering the system too early would alert the Carsons to her awareness and preparedness. Too late, and they might reach their assault positions before the defensive measures activated. The footsteps resumed, now moving with increased purpose toward the cabin. Their pattern indicated final approach, the moment before attackers would typically rush the structure from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah pulled the lever. The reaction was immediate and precisely as Thomas had designed. A series of mechanical triggers activated throughout the surrounding terrain, releasing tensions on carefully positioned wires and setting in motion a cascade of effects that shattered the pre-dawn silence. Tin cans containing pebbles clattered from tree branches. Tripwires released small counterweights that crashed through underbrush. Most significantly, the specialized noisemakers Thomas had positioned at strategic points activated simultaneously, creating a cacophony that echoed across the snow-covered. Clearing from multiple directions, the approaching footsteps halted in confusion, their coordinated pattern disrupted by the sudden chaos. Through the listening device, Sarah heard urgent whispers as the Carson brothers attempted to re-establish communication. "What the hell was that?" The youngest brother's voice, pitched higher with surprise. "She knows we're here." The deeper rasp of the scarred middle brother spread wider, "Move faster." Lyle Carson's authoritative command, attempting to salvage their approach. The disruption had achieved precisely what Thomas intended, forcing attackers to abandon careful coordination in favor of reactive movement. Instead of a synchronized assault from 3 directions, the Carsons were now moving independently, each responding to the unexpected resistance according to individual instinct rather than collective strategy. Sarah activated the second phase of the defense, a series of false targets positioned around the cabin perimeter. Simple mechanisms triggered by the same lever system caused subtle movements at multiple locations. A shutter appearing to close, canvas flapping like someone taking cover, the silhouette of a figure briefly visible before disappearing. The effects were minimal but effective, creating momentary distractions that would draw attention and potentially gunfire away from Sarah's actual position. In the confusion and limited visibility of pre-dawn darkness, these false targets represented potentially significant diversions of the Carsons' limited resources. "Shadow, perimeter sweep," Sarah whispered, giving the dog the command that released him to his specialized role in their defensive strategy. The mountain hound moved silently through the concealed rear exit, disappearing into the darkness to execute his training. Unlike conventional guard dogs that would bark and attack directly, Shadow had been taught a more sophisticated approach: silent observation and strategic harassment that would further confuse and divide attackers' attention. Sarah took position at her primary firing port, rifle ready but still waiting for the optimal moment. Thomas's defensive strategy emphasized patience and opportunity over immediate engagement. Let the attackers reveal their positions and intentions before committing to specific counteraction. Through the listening device, she tracked the Carsons' movements as they attempted to re-establish their approach. Their footsteps had lost the earlier coordination, now moving with the hesitation of men uncertain about what they faced. "She's got the whole place rigged, Lyle," the middle brother's voice, tension evident despite his attempt at whispered communication. "Keep moving. She's one woman with a dog. Tricks won't stop bullets." Lyle's response, maintaining authority despite the disruption of his plan. The exchange confirmed what Sarah had suspected. The Carsons had dismissed her as a helpless widow, unprepared for real resistance. Their fundamental miscalculation had created the opportunity Thomas's defensive strategy required. The eastern horizon had begun to lighten almost imperceptibly, the first hint of approaching dawn that would soon transform the tactical environment completely. Sarah checked her timepiece. 30 minutes until true light would reveal positions that darkness currently concealed. "Let's see how you handle the next surprise," she whispered, reaching for the second defensive lever. The second defensive lever activated what Thomas had called the Ghost Maker, a mechanism designed specifically for the psychological impact it would create during low visibility conditions. Thin white cloths mounted on flexible willow branches suddenly rose from beneath the snow at irregular intervals around the perimeter, their pale forms billowing in the pre-dawn breeze like spectral guardians emerging from the frozen ground. "What the hell?" The youngest Carson's startled exclamation carried clearly through the listening device, followed by the panicked discharge of his revolver, wasting precious ammunition on nothing more than cloth and shadow. Sarah remained motionless, at her position, disciplining her breathing as Thomas had taught her during long hours of training. The urge to fire at the sound of voices was nearly overwhelming, but she resisted. Each shot must serve specific purpose. Random firing would only reveal her position without securing tactical advantage. Outside, Shadow executed his specialized role with lethal efficiency. Moving silently through snow that would have betrayed human footsteps, the mountain hound circled behind the Carson brothers' scattered positions. His training for winter operations made him virtually invisible, a shadow moving among shadows, leaving no trace of his passage except the gradually tightening circle of his surveillance. The scarred middle brother, Wade, had advanced furthest, toward the cabin, using a fallen pine as cover approximately 60 yards from the eastern corner. His position gave him clear fields of fire toward what appeared to be the cabin's most vulnerable approach. But this apparent advantage was an illusion Thomas had deliberately created in his defensive design. Sarah watched through her specialized port as Wade shifted position, attempting to gain better visibility as the first hints of dawn gradually illuminated the landscape. His movement activated the pressure plate Thomas had positioned beneath that exact location. Not a lethal trap, but a cleverly disguised trigger that released the next phase of the cabin's defensive system. A sudden hissing erupted from the snow around Wade's position as the small compressed air canisters Thomas had buried there released their pressure simultaneously. The sound mimicked the warning of a dozen rattlesnakes, triggering instinctive human fear response even in the cold, where no rational person would expect such creatures. Wade's reaction was immediate and uncontrolled. He leapt backward with a startled cry, firing blindly toward the source of the sound while scrambling away from his carefully selected cover position. His sudden movement and noise completely compromised whatever stealth the Carsons had maintained. "Wade, hold position!" Lyle's authoritative command came too late. His brother's panicked reaction had already disrupted their coordinated approach. "Beyond recovery. Something's out here, Lyle." Wade's voice carried notes of genuine fear now. "All around us." Sarah permitted herself a grim smile. Thomas's psychological tactics were working exactly as designed, creating confusion, fear, and division among attackers who had expected to find only a helpless widow taken by surprise. Through the specialized port, she tracked the brothers' increasingly disorganized movements. Jesse, the youngest, had abandoned his flanking position entirely, retreating toward where Lyle maintained somewhat better discipline. Wade continued firing sporadically at imagined threats, each muzzle flash, betraying his position while accomplishing nothing against the cabin's defenses. Dawn's first true light now spilled across the snow-covered clearing, transforming the tactical environment completely. What had been vague shapes and deceptive shadows resolved into distinct forms and clear fields of fire. The transition moment, what Thomas had called the revelation, had arrived, bringing with it the opportunity Sarah had patiently awaited. "Shadow, final position," she whispered into the specialized communication tube that connected to frequencies the dog had been trained to recognize even at distance. The command would bring the mountain hound to his designated attack position, not for immediate engagement, but prepared for the specific role Thomas had designed within their defensive strategy. Sarah shifted to her primary firing position, sighting along her rifle toward the location where Lyle Carson had established his command position, behind a large boulder approximately 80 yards from the cabin's western approach. Unlike his increasingly panicked brothers, Lyle had maintained discipline despite the defensive measures disrupting his planned assault. "She's prepared, Lyle." Wade's voice carried clearly across the snow-covered clearing. "This whole place is rigged. She's one woman," Lyle shouted back, abandoning pretense of stealth now that dawn had fully broken. "Get back in position. We take the cabin now or not at all." His command carried the authority of someone accustomed to control, but Sarah detected the undertone of frustrated realization, the recognition that his carefully planned operation had encountered resistance far beyond anything anticipated. The psychological advantage had shifted, creating the opening Thomas's strategy required. Sarah squeezed the trigger. Her first shot was not aimed at any of the Carson brothers, but at the specialized target Thomas had positioned on the large pine overhanging their most likely command position. The bullet struck with precision, severing the concealed cord that had held a counterweight in place since its installation months earlier. The effect was instantaneous. 50 pounds of stone dropped directly into the snow 5 feet from Lyle's position, with a heavy thud that sent powder exploding upward in a blinding cloud. Not lethal, but psychologically devastating, demonstrating with absolute clarity that his supposedly concealed position had been anticipated and prepared for long before his arrival. "She's got us zeroed, Lyle," Jesse's panicked voice confirmed. The psychological impact of the demonstration. "This ain't no ordinary widow." Sarah's second shot struck the ground 3 feet to the left of Wade's position, deliberately missing the man himself, while demonstrating her ability to target his location with precision. The message was clear. If she could place bullets that accurately, their continued survival represented choice rather than inability. For several seconds, absolute stillness fell across the clearing as the realization penetrated. They were not dealing with a helpless victim, but with someone who had anticipated their attack and prepared methodically to counter it. The silence broke when Lyle Carson's voice rang out, not with another command to his brothers, but addressed directly to the cabin. "Mrs. Blackwood, this doesn't need to end badly for anyone." His tone attempted reasonable negotiation, though his position remained defensive. "We just want to talk terms for the property." Sarah remained silent, moving to a different firing port to maintain position. Uncertainty. Thomas's tactical philosophy emphasized information asymmetry. Let attackers reveal their intentions and positions while providing minimal confirmation of your own. "We're willing to pay fair value," Lyle continued, when no response came from the cabin. "Cash money. You can winter comfortably in town instead of fighting the mountains alone." The offer confirmed Sarah's assessment of their intentions. The Carsons wanted her property intact, not destroyed. The realization provided additional tactical advantage. Attackers who needed to preserve their target operated under constraints that defenders could exploit. "You've had your demonstration, Mrs. Blackwood," Lyle called out after another stretch of silence. "Very impressive, but there are 3 of us and only 1 of you. Let's discuss this reasonably before things get unnecessarily bloody." Sarah finally responded, her voice carrying clearly across the snow-covered clearing. "You're mistaken, Mr. Carson. There are 2 of us." The statement hung in the crisp morning air for a moment before she activated the specialized whistle Thomas had designed, a sound barely perceptible to human hearing, but carrying specific command frequencies Shadow had been trained to recognize at distance. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The mountain hound, who had maneuvered silently into position behind the youngest Carson brother, suddenly made his presence known. Not with dramatic barking or direct attack, but with the low, bone-chilling growl Thomas had specifically trained. A sound that seemed to emerge from everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. Jesse Carson spun wildly, firing his revolver toward the source of the sound but hitting nothing, as Shadow had already shifted position with the fluid movement Thomas had drilled through countless training sessions. The specialized harness the dog wore contained materials specifically designed to distort visual perception in snowy conditions, making him appear to shift and vanish like a living shadow. "There's something out here, Lyle." Jesse's voice had risen nearly to panic. "That ain't no ordinary dog." "Hold your position," Lyle commanded, but the psychological impact of Shadow's seemingly supernatural appearance had already shattered whatever remained of their tactical cohesion. Wade broke, first abandoning his cover to make a dash toward what he perceived as safer position. The movement activated another of Thomas's defensive mechanisms, the specialized tripline that released the modified bear trap concealed beneath the snow. The device snapped closed, not on Wade's leg, but on his boot, capturing him without injury while effectively immobilizing his position. "I'm stuck!" Wade's panicked cry carried across the clearing as he struggled ineffectively against the device. "Something's got me. Stay still!" Lyle shouted, firing a covering shot toward the cabin that went wide of any effective target. "Jesse, help your brother." The youngest Carson hesitated, clearly torn between obeying his brother's command and addressing the seemingly supernatural. Threat Shadow, represented as the Mountain Hound, continued his psychological warfare, appearing briefly before vanishing again, maintaining the specialized growl that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. Sarah used the moment of confusion to implement the final phase of Thomas's defensive strategy. She activated the specialized launcher he had installed beneath the cabin's front porch, a pneumatic device designed to propel non-lethal projectiles across specific vectors of the defensive perimeter. The launcher fired with a distinctive thump, sending the specialized bundle high into the air above the Carson brothers' positions. At the apex of its trajectory, the container burst open, releasing the mixture Thomas had prepared specifically for snow conditions, a combination of fine ash and mineral powders that cascaded downward in a choking cloud, obscuring vision, while creating momentary breathing difficulty for anyone caught beneath. Through the specialized port, Sarah observed the effect as the cloud enveloped the area where Lyle maintained his increasingly untenable command position. His disciplined composure finally broke as he staggered away from the irritating particles, coughing violently while trying unsuccessfully to maintain visual contact with his scattered brothers. "Enough," Sarah called out, her voice carrying authority that silenced even the Carson brothers' panicked communications. "You have 30 seconds to drop your weapons before I stop demonstrating and start shooting to kill." The ultimatum hung in the crystal-clear mountain air, punctuated by the continued ghostly growl Shadow maintained from his unlocatable position within the perimeter. The psychological impact was precisely what Thomas had designed the defensive system to create, the transformation of attackers' confidence into uncertainty and fear. "You can't hold out forever, woman," Lyle shouted back, but his voice lacked the earlier conviction. "There are 3 of us." "2 mobile," Sarah corrected, with cold precision. "1 immobilized, and none of you prepared for what happens next." She activated the specialized signal for Shadow's final demonstration, the culmination of his winter tracking training that Thomas had developed during years facing the most dangerous fugitives in mountain conditions. The Mountain Hound executed the command with flawless precision. Moving with impossible silence through the snow, he approached the trapped Wade Carson from behind. Instead of attacking, Shadow performed the specialized retrieval Thomas had trained, removing the revolver from Wade's holster with such delicate care that the man didn't realize his weapon was gone until Shadow had already retreated with it clutched in his specialized carrying grip. "My gun!" Wade's panic reached new heights as he frantically patted his empty holster. "Something took my gun." The psychological impact of this demonstration proved the breaking point. Not just the loss of the weapon, but the implication of what it represented. A level of training and capability in both woman and dog that defied their understanding of wilderness confrontation. "What kind of witch are you?" Jesse shouted. Toward the cabin, his voice cracking with superstitious fear that had overtaken rational assessment. "The kind who trained with United States Army Scouts," Sarah replied, her voice carrying calm authority that contrasted sharply with their growing panic. "The kind whose husband spent 15 years hunting men through mountain winters before teaching me everything he knew." The statement penetrated even Lyle's determined resistance. The Carson gang had built their reputation on exploiting isolated homesteaders unprepared for organized violence. What they faced now represented something entirely outside their experience. Not just defensive preparations, but specialized training designed specifically for the environment they had chosen to attack within. "Final warning," Sarah called out, cycling her rifle with a distinctive sound that carried clearly across the snow-covered clearing. "Weapons down now, or I start shooting, and unlike you, I don't miss." For several heartbeats, the tableau held, three increasingly desperate outlaws caught in defensive preparations they had never anticipated, facing a widow and dog whose capabilities defied their understanding of possible resistance. Lyle broke. First, his tactical assessment finally overcoming pride and greed. "Hold position!" he shouted to Jesse. "Drop your weapon!" But Lyle, Jesse started to protest. "Do it!" Lyle commanded, his own revolver already falling to the snow beside his position. "She's not bluffing." The youngest Carson hesitated a moment longer before his revolver joined his brother's in the snow. The capitulation wasn't merely tactical. It represented complete psychological defeat, the recognition that they had fundamentally misunderstood what they faced when targeting Sarah Blackwood's mountain homestead. "Wise decision," Sarah acknowledged, maintaining her firing position despite their apparent surrender. Thomas's training had emphasized the danger of premature relaxation of defensive posture. "Now walk toward the cabin, hands visible. Any movement toward those weapons activates the dog's final protocol." As if to emphasize her warning, Shadow materialized briefly at the edge of the clearing, Wade Carson's revolver still held in his specialized carrying grip, a visual demonstration of capabilities that transformed the mountain hound from mere animal to tactical weapon in the outlaw's perception. "This isn't over," Lyle muttered as he complied with her instructions, moving slowly toward the cabin with hands raised. "You can't hold us forever." "I don't need to," Sarah replied, a cold smile touching her lips for the first time since the confrontation began. The storm's passed. Ranger Torres will be making his patrol to check on homesteaders after the blizzard. Should arrive within the hour. The information struck Lyle visibly, not just the impending arrival of law enforcement, but the implication that Sarah had anticipated and planned for this outcome from the beginning. The Carson gang's carefully orchestrated winter operation hadn't just failed. It had been countered with a level of strategic foresight they hadn't believed possible from an isolated widow. As dawn fully illuminated the snow-covered clearing, revealing the Carson brothers' complete vulnerability against defenses they had never imagined, Sarah allowed herself a moment of silent gratitude for Thomas's meticulous preparation. The home they had built together had withstood its greatest test, not through sheer force, but through the careful application of knowledge against those who had fatally underestimated both the widow and her dog. The mountain sun climbed higher, in a sky washed clean by the storm, casting brilliant light across the snow-covered clearing, where three of the territory's most notorious outlaws now stood disarmed and defeated. Sarah maintained her vigilant position behind the specialized firing port, rifle steady despite the hours of tension that had preceded this moment. Shadow had materialized at the edge of the tree line, his coal-black form a stark contrast against the pristine white landscape, the retrieved revolver still held in his specialized carrying grip. "On your knees," Sarah commanded, her voice carrying the unquestionable authority of someone who held absolute tactical advantage. "Hands behind your heads." Lyle Carson's expression darkened with barely contained fury, the humiliation of their defeat evidently warring with his instinct for self-preservation. For a moment, Sarah thought he might attempt some final desperate resistance, but practicality ultimately prevailed. He sank slowly to his knees in the snow, hands clasping reluctantly behind his head. "You too," she directed toward Jesse, who had remained frozen in place, his young face betraying the superstitious fear that Shadow's seemingly supernatural capabilities had instilled. He complied immediately, almost grateful for the clear instruction in a situation that had spiraled far beyond his understanding. Wade presented a more complicated problem, still partially immobilized by the modified bear trap that had captured his boot. His attempts to free himself had ceased, replaced by sullen resignation as he realized the extent of their miscalculation. "I can't exactly kneel with this thing on my foot," he called out, gesturing toward the device with a mixture of anger and grudging respect. "What kind of setup is this anyway? Army doesn't teach traps like these." "My husband's improvements," Sarah replied, maintaining her disciplined focus despite the apparent surrender. Thomas's training had emphasized that the moment of seeming victory often preceded the most dangerous countermeasures from desperate opponents. He believed in adaptation. With practiced efficiency, Sarah secured a position that allowed her to maintain coverage of all three brothers, while retrieving the specialized restraints Thomas had prepared for precisely this scenario. Not ordinary rope that might provide opportunity for escape, but reinforced leather cuffs with interlocking mechanisms that would require specific tools to remove. "Shadow, secure perimeter," she commanded, the mountain hound immediately responding to his tactical assignment. While maintaining visible presence at the edge of the clearing, a psychological deterrent against any renewed resistance from the Carsons, the dog began a systematic sweep of the surrounding forest, ensuring no additional threats remained. Undetected, the specialized training that had seemed excessive during peaceful times now proved its value beyond question. Thomas had prepared them not just for everyday survival in the harsh mountain environment, but for the specific threats that isolated homesteads might face in lawless territories. His foresight had transformed what should have been an easy target for the Carson gang into an insurmountable defensive position. As Sarah secured Lyle's wrists with the specialized restraints, she noted the calculating assessment in his eyes. Not just anger at defeat, but analytical recognition of capabilities he had failed to anticipate. Unlike his brothers, whose responses remained primarily emotional, Lyle Carson was processing information, recalibrating his understanding of the widow who had so thoroughly demolished his carefully planned operation. "You're not just some homesteader's wife," he observed as she tightened the restraints with practiced precision. "Military?" "Teacher, actually," Sarah replied, moving to secure Jesse with similar efficiency. "From Denver, before I met Thomas." "No school teacher does what you just did," Lyle countered, watching as she worked. "Those were coordinated defensive operations, tactical psychology, military-grade training." Sarah secured Jesse's restraints before responding. "My husband served 15 years as an Army scout, specializing in winter operations and fugitive tracking. He believed in thorough preparation and knowledge transfer." Understanding dawned in Lyle's expression, not just of their tactical defeat, but of the fundamental miscalculation that had led to it. The Carson gang had targeted what appeared to be a vulnerable widow, alone in an isolated cabin, never considering that she might represent something entirely different, the trained partner of a military specialist who had systematically prepared for precisely the threat they presented. "Thomas Blackwood," he said, recognition finally registering. "Your husband was Thomas Blackwood." Sarah stilled momentarily, surprised by the recognition of a name she hadn't mentioned. "You knew him?" A mirthless laugh escaped Lyle's throat. "Knew of him. Every outlaw in 3 territories knew of Blackwood. The man who tracked Hatcher's gang through a 5-day blizzard when everyone else said it couldn't be done. The scout who brought in the Williams brothers after they disappeared into the high country." The acknowledgement of Thomas's reputation carried surprising weight. Sarah had known her husband's military service had involved tracking dangerous men through difficult terrain, but he had rarely discussed specific operations or the reputation he had apparently established among the very outlaws he pursued. "If I'd known we were hitting Blackwood's widow, we'd have given this mountain a wide berth," Lyle continued, genuine chagrin evident beneath his controlled exterior. "Man like that doesn't leave his wife unprepared, even after he's gone." The Strange conversation was interrupted by Shadow's return to the clearing, his posture communicating the completion of his perimeter check with no additional threats detected. More remarkably, the mountain hound now carried what appeared to be the reins of the Carson brothers' horses, having somehow retrieved the animals from their concealed position in the forest and guided them back to the clearing. Jesse's eyes widened with renewed superstitious fear. "That ain't natural," he whispered. "No dog does that." "Shadow isn't just any dog," Sarah replied, allowing herself a moment of pride in their partnership. The retrieval represented one of the most complex tasks in Shadow's specialized training, locating specific animals by scent and returning them to a designated location. A capability Thomas had developed for practical purposes that now served unexpected tactical advantage. With the horses secured and the three brothers restrained, Sarah faced the final challenge: maintaining control, until Ranger Torres arrived to take the outlaws into official custody. Despite her tactical victory, she remained a single defender against three men with every motivation to attempt escape if opportunity presented itself. The solution lay in Thomas's comprehensive defensive design. From beneath the cabin's front steps, Sarah retrieved the specialized transport restraints he had modified from military designs, a series of interlocked cuffs and chains that would secure prisoners to their own mounts while preventing coordinated movement or escape attempts. "You've got to be kidding me," Wade muttered as she approached with the equipment. "What kind of homesteader keeps prison transport gear?" "The kind married to Thomas Blackwood, apparently," Lyle responded with grudging respect. "We really stepped in it this time, brothers." The specialized restraints allowed Sarah to secure each man to his horse in a configuration that prevented them from assisting one another while maintaining sufficient stability for mounted travel. The design represented Thomas's practical experience transporting captured fugitives through difficult terrain, knowledge he had transferred to Sarah during their years together on the mountain. With the Carsons secured, Sarah permitted herself a moment to assess her own condition. The confrontation had demanded hours of focused tension, both physical and mental. Despite her careful preparation, fatigue now threatened at the edges of her awareness, the natural response to sustained vigilance and the ebbing of survival adrenaline. Shadow appeared at her side, pressing his solid warmth against her leg. In what seemed like deliberate support, the mountain hound's unwavering attention throughout the confrontation had never flagged, a testament to both his specialized training and the unique bond they had formed in the months since Thomas's death. "We did it, boy," she said quietly, allowing her hand to rest briefly on his powerful shoulder. Thomas would be proud. The distant sound of approaching hoofbeats drew her attention back to tactical awareness. A single rider was approaching along the eastern trail, the direction from which Ranger Torres would arrive during his post-storm patrol. Sarah maintained defensive position nonetheless, rifle ready until visual confirmation established the rider's identity. Torres appeared at the edge of the clearing, his official uniform distinctive against the snow-covered landscape. The ranger reined his horse to an abrupt halt as he registered the unexpected tableau before him. Three restrained men on horseback, a woman with a rifle maintaining guard position, and a coal-black mountain hound whose alert posture communicated continued vigilance despite the apparent conclusion of hostilities. "Mrs. Blackwood?" Torres called out, his hand instinctively moving toward his sidearm as he assessed the situation. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine, Ranger," Sarah responded, lowering her rifle slightly but maintaining ready position until Torres fully entered the clearing. "Just entertaining some unexpected visitors who had designs on my property." Torres urged his mount forward, eyes widening as he recognized the restrained men. "The Carson gang," he breathed, disbelief evident in his expression. "You captured the Carson gang? Alone?" Not alone, Sarah corrected, glancing toward Shadow, who maintained his vigilant position beside her. We worked as a team. The ranger dismounted, approaching with the caution of a man who had seen enough frontier violence to recognize the aftermath of serious confrontation. His gaze swept across the clearing, taking in the evidence of Thomas's defensive preparations. The triggered mechanisms, the specialized equipment, the systematic approach that had transformed a simple homestead into an impenetrable fortress. I've been chasing these men for months, Torres said, studying the restrained outlaws with professional assessment. Every lawman from here to Cheyenne has been looking for them. 6 robberies, 3 suspected murders, and countless homesteaders terrorized across 2 territories. They picked the wrong cabin, Sarah replied simply. Torres turned to her with newfound respect in his expression. Mrs. Blackwood, I don't know how you managed this, but what you've accomplished. Here, it's unprecedented. These men have evaded military patrols and professional posses with twice the manpower and resources. I had good training, she acknowledged, and excellent help. Her hand rested briefly on Shadow's head, the mountain hound maintaining his disciplined alertness despite the official presence that might have relaxed a less thoroughly trained animal. As Torres secured the Carson brothers for transport to the territorial jail in Elk Creek, Sarah provided a concise account of the confrontation, the outlaws' initial reconnaissance, their return during the storm, and the defensive preparations that had ultimately defeated their assault. Her report remained factual and precise, reflecting the disciplined approach Thomas had instilled during their years together. You mentioned they specifically targeted your property, Torres noted, as he verified the security of the specialized restraints. Any idea why? Most of their previous targets were stagecoaches, banks, or wealthy ranches with obvious valuables. Location, Sarah explained. My cabin sits at the junction of 3 major game trails that connect different parts of the Widow's Range. Perfect position for controlling movement through these mountains, especially during winter when the main passes are frequently snowbound. Torres nodded with professional understanding. Strategic thinking. They wanted a secure winter headquarters that would allow them to expand their territory while remaining beyond easy reach of law enforcement. Exactly, Sarah confirmed, though they didn't anticipate the reception they'd receive. A grim smile touched the ranger's weather-beaten face. Clearly not. He glanced toward Lyle Carson, who had maintained stony silence during their exchange. Bet that was quite the surprise, finding out whose widow you were targeting. Lyle's expression tightened, but he offered no response to the ranger's needling. The outlaw leader's calculating gaze remained fixed on Sarah, still assessing the woman who had so thoroughly dismantled his operation and reputation in a single morning's confrontation. I'll need you to come to Elk Creek within the week to provide formal testimony, Torres explained as he prepared to depart with his prisoners. These men have outstanding warrants across multiple territories. Your statement will ensure they face justice for all their crimes, not just today's attempted attack. Sarah nodded her agreement, though the prospect of leaving her mountain sanctuary, even temporarily, created unexpected apprehension. Since Thomas's death, the cabin had become her entire world, a place of safety and purpose in a life otherwise transformed by loss. As if sensing her unease, Shadow pressed against her leg in silent reassurance, the mountain hound's steady presence reminded her of Thomas's most frequent lesson, that security came not from isolation, but from preparedness and adaptation to changing circumstances. I'll come, she assured Torres. Just send word when you need me. With formal arrangements completed, Torres prepared the prisoners for the journey to Elk Creek. The specialized restraints Sarah had applied required no modification, their design already superior to the standard issue equipment the ranger carried for conventional arrests. "You know," Torres commented as he mounted his horse and took control of the lead lines connecting the Carson brothers' mounts, "there's been talk in the territorial capital about establishing a more formal law enforcement presence in these mountains. Too many homesteaders vulnerable to men like these, too few rangers to cover the territory effectively." Sarah made no response, unsure where his observation was leading. Torres studied her for a moment before continuing. "A person with your capabilities would be valuable in such an organization. Someone who understands these mountains, who knows how to track and defend when conventional approaches fail." The suggestion caught Sarah entirely by surprise. Since Thomas's death, she had envisioned no future beyond maintaining their homestead and honoring the life they had built together. The possibility of purposeful engagement beyond simple survival had never entered her consideration. "I'm not a lawman, Ranger Torres," she replied carefully. "Just a widow defending her home." "What you did here goes well beyond simple defense," Torres countered, gesturing toward the evidence of her systematic dismantling of the Carson gang's assault. "That's tactical thinking, disciplined execution, the kind of capability these mountains desperately need." Before Sarah could formulate a response, Lyle Carson's voice cut through the conversation, the first words he had spoken since Torres's arrival. "Listen to him, Mrs. Blackwood," the outlaw leader advised, surprising both Sarah and the ranger with his intervention. "Men like me target these mountains precisely because conventional law enforcement can't function effectively in these conditions. What you did today, that's the only approach that works against determined opposition in terrain like this." The unexpected support from her defeated adversary carried strange weight. Lyle's assessment came not from moral alignment, but from professional recognition, one tactician acknowledging the effectiveness of another's approach. "I'll consider it," Sarah replied non-committally, though the seed of possibility had been planted in ground she hadn't realized was fertile. As Torres departed with his unexpected prisoners, Sarah remained on her cabin porch, Shadow vigilant beside her until the small procession disappeared around the bend in the trail. Only then did she permit herself to truly process the events of the past 24 hours, not just the tactical victory, but its broader implications for her life moving forward. The confrontation had demonstrated capabilities she hadn't fully recognized in herself despite Thomas's thorough training. Not just technical skills of defense and tracking, but the psychological resilience to face lethal threat without surrendering to fear or impulsive reaction. Capabilities that represented not just survival potential, but possible purpose beyond. The isolated existence she had maintained since Thomas's death. Shadow pressed against her leg, his warm presence grounding her contemplation in immediate reality. The Mountain Hound's specialized training had proven decisive in the confrontation, transforming what might have been a desperate last stand into a comprehensive tactical victory. Their partnership represented something Thomas had emphasized repeatedly during their training sessions, the multiplication of capability through coordinated teamwork rather than individual effort alone. "Come on, boy," she said finally, turning toward the cabin door. "We have work to do." The interior bore subtle evidence of the night's vigilance, defensive positions established and maintained, equipment deployed according to Thomas's meticulous plans. Sarah moved through the space with renewed appreciation for her husband's foresight. What had sometimes seemed excessive preparation had proven precisely calibrated to the threats they might face in this remote wilderness. She retrieved her journal from its hiding place, recording the day's events with the same disciplined precision that characterized her tactical operations. The written account served multiple purposes: documentation for potential legal proceedings, analysis for future security improvements, and perhaps most importantly, processing of her own evolving understanding of capabilities and possibilities. As she wrote, Sarah found herself including considerations that would have seemed unimaginable just days earlier. Not just maintenance of isolated security, but potential engagement with broader community protection throughout the surrounding mountains. Torres's suggestion had awakened possibilities that aligned with skills and purpose she hadn't recognized within herself. The journal entry concluded not with the simple survival notation that had characterized her writing since Thomas's death, but with forward-looking consideration. The Carson gang's defeat demonstrates that effective security in these mountains requires specialized approach beyond conventional law enforcement capabilities. Torres suggests territorial authorities recognize this reality and seek new methods appropriate to these conditions. Perhaps Thomas's knowledge, transferred through our years of training together, represents not just personal security, but potential contribution to broader community protection. Shadow's capabilities proved decisive against determined opposition. His specialized training for winter tracking and coordinated tactical operations represents capabilities unavailable through conventional means. Our partnership might serve purposes beyond this isolated homestead, purposes Thomas would have recognized as worthy extension of his lifetime of service. As darkness settled over the mountain, Sarah completed evening security protocols with renewed purpose. The defensive preparations that had defeated the Carson gang's assault required restoration and improvement, not just for immediate security, but as refinement of systems that might serve broader application. Shadow maintained his disciplined vigilance throughout these activities, his understanding of their partnership seemingly extending beyond trained responses to shared purpose. The Mountain Hound's specialized capabilities represented Thomas's legacy as surely as the defensive preparations that had protected their home, knowledge transferred and preserved against future need. When preparations were complete, Sarah stood on her cabin porch beneath a star-filled sky, surveying the moonlit landscape that stretched beyond her isolated homestead. The mountains that had represented refuge after Thomas's death now suggested possibility beyond mere survival. Territory where her specialized knowledge and capabilities might serve purpose she hadn't previously considered. "What do you think?" "Shadow," she asked quietly, the Mountain Hound attentive beside her, "is there work for us beyond this cabin?" Shadow's focused attention conveyed understanding beyond ordinary animal comprehension. The partnership that had defeated the territory's most notorious outlaws might extend to purposes worthy of the training Thomas had invested in them both. The cold mountain air carried crystalline clarity as Sarah made her decision. The isolated widow the Carson gang had targeted no longer existed, replaced by a woman who had recognized capabilities and purpose beyond mere survival. Thomas's legacy lived not just in defensive preparations and specialized training, but in the potential for meaningful contribution to the mountains they had both loved. "We'll go to Elk Creek next week," she told Shadow, her resolution solidifying into commitment, not just for testimony, but to discuss Torres's suggestion properly. The Mountain Hound's attentive response suggested approval of direction that aligned with his specialized training and purpose. The partnership Thomas had created would continue to evolve, serving needs beyond the isolated homestead where their journey had begun. As Sarah turned to enter the cabin, her gaze fell on the wedding daguerreotype carefully preserved on the mantel. Thomas in his scout uniform, his hand resting on a younger Shadow's head, his expression conveying the determined purpose that had characterized his service. The image represented not just memory of what had been, but foundation for what might yet become. "You were right, Thomas," she whispered to the empty cabin that nonetheless felt filled with his enduring presence. "It was never just about survival, it was about purpose, worthy of the knowledge you shared." Shadow settled into his vigilant position, near the door, maintaining the disciplined awareness that had proven decisive against determined threat. The Mountain Hound's specialized training represented not limitation to a single role, but adaptable capability that might serve broader purpose throughout the territory. As the fire burned low in the stone hearth Thomas had built with his own hands, Sarah Blackwood contemplated the path forward with newfound clarity. The widow and her dog, so easily dismissed by the Carson gang as vulnerable isolation, would emerge from their mountain sanctuary to extend Thomas's legacy of protection and service throughout the territory's most challenging terrain. The bandits, who had taunted a widow's dog, unaware she had trained it to track men through mountain storms, had unwittingly catalyzed transformation beyond mere survival. Their defeat represented not just tactical victory, but awakening to purpose that would reshape the frontier justice of the widow's range for years to come. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.